Larry Fedora's third season in Chapel Hill concluded with a blowout loss to Rutgers out of the Big Ten in the Quick Lane Bowl. Larry Fedora at 13-11 in 3 seasons in the ACC, 21-17 overall, but the trend is going down. He's got a lot of starters coming back on both offense and defense. We shall see if he's able to buck the trend and get Carolina headed back to its winning ways. We bring in Mike McDaniel of Inside the ACC to break down the Tar Heels. Mike, let's start at quarterback, and that's where Carolina rests its hopes this season because they've got one of the better dual-threat quarterbacks in the nation.
Yeah, their quarterback actually led the team in rushing last year, but Marquis Williams is coming back as a senior. He's one of the premier quarterbacks in the Atlantic Coast Conference, has 63% completion percentage last year, threw for over 3,000 yards, 21 touchdowns to only 9 interceptions. So he's a very, very efficient passer, and he provides a good dual threat as well. His 788 yards, like I said, led his team in rushing, and he also had 13 touchdowns. So he's the premier player. As long as he doesn't get hurt, Carolina should be trending in the right direction, and their offense should continue to play well.
Mike, when I mentioned off the top all the starters coming back on offense, and then you nailed it down to 10 coming back there, it's actually 100% of the rushing yardage. It's 99% of the passing yardage. It's 84% of the receiving yardage. So the rushing game in really good shape. They've got a lot of depth. They've got different guys that can do different things to hurt a defense.
Yeah, and Marquis Williams isn't the only guy who can run the ball well. They got TJ Logan coming back. He's their leading rusher, he's their leading rusher out of the running backs, 582 yards and 3 touchdowns last year. They're also returning 2 other backs, Romar Morris and Elijah Hood, and the 2 of those guys combined for 537 yards and 8 touchdowns last year. So those are 2 running backs who are able to solidify the run game behind TJ Logan, who will once again be the lead back for Carolina in 2015. They had an explosive offense last year. They were 45th nationally, so almost 430 yards per game. So the passing and the rushing did them wonders last year. In the passing game, they have a couple of big-time receivers returning and 2 other guys who contributed admirably last year. Ryan Switzer is the leading receiver. He's known more for his kick return duties. As you remember, in 2013, when he was a freshman, he was an All-American. So he was one of the top kick returners in the country. But at receiver, he does wonders for Carolina as well. 61 catches, led the team last year, and his 757 yards and 4 touchdowns also helped lead the Tar Heels. They also have Quinshaw Davis, Mac Hollins, and Bug Howard at receiver. 3 of those guys 6'4" and taller. 41 catches, 470 yards, and 6 touchdowns for Quinshaw Davis last year. Mac Hollins, 35 catches, 613 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And Bug Howard, who was actually seen taking some snaps at tight end this year for Carolina throughout most of fall camp. He had 42 catches for 455 yards and 2 touchdowns at receiver last year. So a lot of their production and big playmakers are back for 2015.
Yeah, what really stands out to me here, Mike, is Ryan Switzer. You mentioned his emergence as a freshman was as much in the kicking game as it was as a pass receiver. He had 5 punt return touchdowns as a freshman. That is a crazy number. He led the nation in punt return average. And also Mac Hollins only caught 35 passes, but it's 17.5 per reception. You mentioned that with the 8 touchdowns. So obviously he makes big plays downfield in the passing game. Along the offensive line, they've got Landon Turner and also John Heck coming back with 3 years of starting experience up front. So Mike, let's talk some defense. We could talk defense all night if we're talking North Carolina. It was atrocious, to say the least, in 2014. But they have some hope in regards to athletes and also the guy in charge.
Yeah, so Larry Fedora is on a little bit of a hot seat, you would say, with the defense as bad as it was last year. Horrific is the word. 117th out of 125 in total defense last year, 122nd in third down defense. And they allowed 497.8 yards per game and 67 total total touchdowns allowed last year. Additionally, 31 touchdown passes allowed was an ACC record. So the defense was historically bad last year for Carolina. But they're bringing in Gene Chizik, and you may remember him from his time there at Auburn. Chizik they won the national championship in 2010 with him at the helm as head coach. But in the early 2000s for Auburn, he recorded some great years there as the defensive coordinator. a couple of his squads there were tops in the country. And they got some good young defensive linemen. Sophomore Nazir Jones and freshman Jeremiah Clark are going to lead the interior defensive line. So the hope is that Carolina will improve this year, and there's no reason to believe that they couldn't take a step forward after how historically bad they were last year. They're switching from a 4-2-5 defense to a 4-3, which a lot of the players have been talking about throughout the summer and throughout fall camp, as the scheme has been a little bit easier to adjust to and a little bit easier to understand. So the hope is that Carolina will be able to improve there on the defensive end.
Mike, you mentioned Clark. They also have a freshman up front in Jalen Dalton. They feel pretty good about his potential in contributing this season. The secondary was so bad, along with the absence of a consistent pass rush, that they gave up 31 touchdown passes through the air. They do have 7 of 8 defensive backs coming back, including Brian Walker, who's a pretty standout player with 3 interceptions. Also, Jeff Schottmer, the middle linebacker, had an outstanding spring. He was second on the team in total tackles last year with 74 and 6 tackles for loss. Mike, this team missed all of its field goals past 30 yards last year. There's a number for you. 0 for 7 on field goals past 30 yards. You would think it was like 1953 in Chapel Hill. All right, let's look at the schedule here. And it's a manageable schedule, to be kind to the schedule makers, because I'm sure Georgia Tech would love to have this schedule, considering they've got Clemson and Florida State out of the other division. But for North Carolina, it sets up pretty well.
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, they have the one out-of-conference matchup there with South Carolina at the beginning of the season. That's the one SEC opponent they consistently play year in and year out. And that'll be a tough little matchup for them out of the gate. South Carolina's coming off of a down year last year, so with Steve Spurrier hoping that his team will improve heading into 2015 as well. So that should be an interesting matchup there in Charlotte to open up the season. Nice little neutral site matchup there. And then looking down the schedule, they outside of the South Carolina game, they play North Carolina A&T. They play Illinois, who's struggled in the Big Ten throughout the last couple seasons, and they got Delaware, an FCS opponent, throughout the first 4 games before heading down to Georgia Tech, which will be a tough go of it there for their 5th game of the season. So the first half of the season is manageable. I think that they could easily be 4-1 with maybe a lone loss to South Carolina. I think that they have a chance to, make some noise there, upset Georgia Tech at Bobby Dodd Stadium in Atlanta, but at worst, potentially a 3-2 start and only 1 loss in conference heading into the second half of their schedule.
Mike, they were able to figure out how to get all 4 non-conference games at home. You mentioned the one off the top against South Carolina, a team that finished at 7-6 that has a new starting quarterback this season in Connor Mitch. The 3rd game against Illinois on the surface would appear to be an even matchup. Both teams coming off bowl losses and 6-7 records, but I think you teed it up rather well with the Illini. They're in upheaval right now. They lost their head coach, Tim Beckman, amidst all sorts of off-field controversy. So they lose their head coach going into the season, just 6 days until the season starts. Also, they've got an exceptional quarterback in Wes Lunt. He's a pretty good gunslinger, but they lose their best wide receiver from last season as well, who caught 76 passes. So Illinois on the downslide. I would think North Carolina, considering what they've got back on offense, is going to be a little bit too much to handle for the Illini at home. We mentioned the light slate in the ACC. It sets up well with going with the out-of-division games against Wake Forest on October 17th, North Carolina State to finish things up on November 28th. Of course, Georgia Tech is the king of the division right now. There is a possibility that whether it be North Carolina or Virginia Tech, they could, because of their easier slate with the 2 games out of division, they could lose to Georgia Tech. And since Georgia Tech and Miami, we can throw the Canes in there, both have to play Florida State and Clemson, you could lose that head-to-head, but then take the other 2 out of division games and come out on top and make your way to the ACC championship game. So any predictions in looking at this schedule? Where do we see the heels falling here?
Well, when taking a look at the schedule here later in the season, that Virginia Tech matchup obviously stands out to me. That'll be a real tough game for North Carolina. I think that's the one game in the second half of their schedule that they have a really, really good chance of losing, especially, since it's at Lane Stadium there in Blacksburg. But the North Carolina State game's interesting. That could go either way. It's essentially a toss-up. I really like NC State in the Atlantic Division this year to be kind of a dark horse. They may not reach the level of Clemson and Florida State, but if some things fall their way, NC State could potentially get into the mix there in the Atlantic, just as UNC could easily get into the race here in the Coastal if things fall their way and their defense improves. But I think Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech are the two toughest games there in conference for the Tar Heels. And if those are the only two games they lose, they're going to be right in the mix at the end of the season and right there with a great chance, I think, to represent the Coastal in the ACC championship game. But it all hinges on that defense and whether or not they can improve. They do get Miami at home, which I think is another toss-up game. So anytime you get the Canes, you're not sure. We're all still waiting for Al Golden and his squad to actually show up with all the recruits they've acquired here over the last couple seasons. So if Miami's if Miami turns out to be very good this year, then that could be another tough game. But you just never know with the Canes, and they seem to be in upheaval as well. They do have Brad Kaya, quarterback, but they have a lot of offensive line shuffling around there and a lot of overturning there at the line. So if Brad Kaya can stay upright, Miami has a chance to be good, but you just never know. And Golden's on the hot seat there, so that that could potentially be a tough game. But outside of that, they got Duke there the week prior to Miami on November 7th. The Duke game could be interesting, but I think Duke's taking a step back this year. So I think UNC will have a good chance to win that game as well. So we'll just have to see. I think 2 losses in conference would be best case scenario, because I'm not sure they'll be able to upset Georgia Tech. They will have a chance, but that will be a very tough game on the road, and then a tough game there towards the end of the season at Virginia Tech. So I think 2 conference losses would be best case scenario. They could essentially go 7-1 in conference, but I think 2 conference losses is not out of the question, a pretty reasonable estimate.
Mike and I are just carving through these ACC previews, so catch the podcasts on Inside the ACC or the videos here, Mark Rogers TV on YouTube. Mike, again, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.